The year was 1874, and silence clung to the hills like dust after a cattle drive. On the edge of the New Mexico territory stood a lonely ranch, weather-beaten boards warped by sun and storm, its windows staring blank at the plains as though they had grown tired of watching the years pass. For 21 of those years, a man lived inside that house, alone, unseen by most, and spoken of by few. They called him the Hermit Rancher, though his name was Ethan Cole. Once long ago he'd ridden with men, drunk in saloons, even laughed. That was before death laid its hand heavy on him and pressed the sound out of his life. Since then, the only voice that filled the air belonged to the wind in the grass and the wolves in the canyon. Every morning was the same. He rose with the cold, stirred the embers on the hearth, poured black coffee into a tin cup, and stepped out onto the porch with his rifle cradled in one arm. The land stretched out before him, harsh and empty, his cattle no more than dark specks against the dawn. He'd mend a fence if it sagged, patch a roof if it leaked, and if a storm came, he'd ride it out with his back to the fire, saying nothing, remembering nothing, or at least trying not to. That was the life he chose, the punishment he thought he deserved, and he lived it with the kind of stubbornness only grief can give a man. But the frontier has a way of breaking the walls men build around themselves. It came for Ethan on a day as ordinary as any other. He first heard it in the distance, faint at first, almost hidden beneath the wind. The creak of wheels, the slow, uneven groan of a wagon axle. His head lifted, and he listened. No wagon had turned down this way in years. The trail was dry and unforgiving, and no one sought a hermit's company. Yet the sound drew closer, like an echo carried over the hills. He went for his rifle, the old Winchester he kept close, and stepped into the yard. His boots sank into the dust, and his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. Then he saw them. Not a wagon, but a figure, no, several, coming on foot. At first he thought it a trick of the heat, a mirage bending the horizon. But they kept coming, slow, weary, dragging themselves toward his land. It was a woman, taller than any he'd seen, shoulders broad as a man's, a shawl draped across her back, though it could not hide the strength in her frame. At her side clung 3 children, ragged, dusty, their steps unsteady, their faces pale with hunger. The smallest stumbled, and the woman bent to lift her without breaking stride. Ethan felt the air shift inside him. Strangers. Trouble. Nothing good came from opening his door, not anymore. He thought of turning back, slipping into the safety of his house, but the woman's eyes found him even across the distance. There was no hesitation in them, no shame in her stride. She carried desperation like a banner, but pride too, and it unsettled him. When they reached the fence line, the children hung back. Dust clung to their lashes, their lips cracked from thirst. The woman stepped forward alone, her shadow falling long across the yard. "We need shelter," she said, her voice low but firm. "Just for the night." Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. He hadn't spoken to a stranger in years. His throat rasped when he answered. "Keep walking. Nothing for you here." Her gaze did not flinch. "My husband is dead. Outlaws took him. Burned our wagon. My children need rest. Food. We won't stay longer than a day." The words struck hard. Outlaws. Fire. A dead man. Trouble just as he feared. He should have shut the gate, sent them on their way, kept to the silence, he knew. Yet the sight of those children gnawed at him, the boy standing stiff, pretending he wasn't afraid, the middle child chewing her lip till it bled, the smallest slumped against her mother's shoulder, too weak even to cry. He lowered the barrel of the rifle, though it remained in his hands. "Don't want strangers under my roof," he said. "You think I want to be here?" She shot back, a flash of anger in her eyes. "If there was another roof in 50 miles, I'd be under it. But there isn't. And my children won't make it another night under the stars." Ethan felt something stir inside him. Old, painful, unwelcome. He remembered another night, another child, the fever that burned too hot, the wife who lay pale and still by morning. He had buried them both under the cottonwood, and he buried himself with them. Now here stood a woman forcing him to remember what he'd spent 2 decades forgetting. "Come in," he muttered at last, and turned toward the house. Inside, the cabin was bare as a church stripped for winter. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth. Dust thick on every surface, for one man made little mess. The children stepped in hesitantly, wide-eyed, as if they had crossed into a stranger's dream. The woman did not wait for him to offer. She laid the smallest child on the bench, then squared her shoulders. "We'll work for our keep. I don't take charity." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. Most widows he'd known bent quick under hardship. This one stood like iron. She was taller than him by an inch, and though weariness dragged at her, she looked ready to fight the whole frontier barehanded if it meant her children survived. "There's stew," he said gruffly, ladling the thin broth from a pot kept simmering on the stove. He set it before them. The children fell on it with quiet desperation, spoons clattering, broth spilling down chins. The woman ate slower, though her eyes betrayed her hunger. Ethan stood apart, watching, uncomfortable with their presence. His house felt smaller now, as if the walls leaned in, forcing him to see what he had been without for so long. Voices, warmth, the scrape of spoons, the small noises of life. When the meal was done, the boy, 10, maybe 11, slipped toward the pantry and reached for the bread crusts left on the shelf. Ethan caught him with a sharp word. The boy froze, hand trembling. "Leave him," the woman said quickly. "He's hungry. We all are." Ethan's mouth hardened, but he said nothing. Instead, he pushed the loaf toward the boy. The child's eyes widened, and he nodded once in gratitude. Ethan looked away, uncomfortable at the thanks. That night, as the wind whistled through the cracks in the shutters, Ethan sat awake with his rifle across his knees. The woman and her children slept in the corner, huddled together like wolves in a den. He should have felt safe within his own walls, but he didn't. He felt exposed. The frontier had noticed him again, after years of leaving him alone. Outside, something moved, a crunch of gravel, soft but sure. Ethan rose, silent, and edged to the window. Moonlight spilled silver across the yard, and there, just beyond the barn, were boot prints, fresh in the dirt. He followed them with his eyes into the dark, where shadows shifted, then vanished. His chest tightened. They hadn't come alone. Trouble followed them, as sure as night follows day. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes narrowing into the dark. For the first time in 21 years, his solitude was broken, not by choice, not by mercy, but by fate dragging strangers to his door. And fate, Ethan knew, was never kind. The morning came with a stillness that unsettled Ethan more than any storm. The sun climbed over the ridge, red as a fresh wound, its light spilling across the yard where the dust held prints too sharp, too recent. He crouched near the barn, fingertips brushing the marks. Boots. More than one pair. Men had been here in the night, circling his land, testing the ground. He straightened slowly, the weight of the Winchester heavy in his hands. Inside the house, the children stirred awake, their voices soft as bird calls. The woman was already on her feet, her broad shoulders squared as she split kindling with a hatchet she had found by the door. Each swing struck with a strength that startled him. She saw the set of his jaw when he came back in, the way he moved like a man expecting a fight. "They were here, weren't they?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, only set the rifle against the wall and poured bitter coffee into a cup. She waited, patient as stone, until at last he gave a single nod. "They'll come again," she said, voice low. He studied her, the lines of her face carved by hunger and sleepless nights, but her eyes held no fear, only resolve. It made him uneasy. He'd seen men buckle under less, and yet here she stood, steady as if she'd been born for battle. "What did your husband owe them?" Ethan asked. She glanced toward the children before answering. "Everything. Cards, whiskey, pride. He promised them money he never had. When they came to collect, he tried to run. They shot him in the back, burned our wagon, said they'd take the rest of what was theirs from me." Her hand curled into a fist around the hatchet handle. "I wasn't about to let them." Ethan's silence stretched. He'd wanted solitude, yet trouble had walked through his gate and sat itself at his table. And still, something in him resisted the urge to turn them away. The eldest boy, Sam, stepped forward then, awkward but trying to be useful. "I can help with the cattle, sir. I can ride. Rope too." Ethan looked down at him, at the thin arms, the proud chin held too high. He remembered his own boy, long buried. For a moment his throat closed. He nodded once. "You'll ride fence with me today." Sam's eyes lit, though he tried to hide it. His mother gave Ethan a small, almost imperceptible nod. By noon they were out along the northern fence line, the boy astride a shaggy mare Ethan hadn't ridden in years. The heat pressed down, and dust clung to their throats. Sam worked hard, quick to mimic the rancher's movements, eager to prove himself. Ethan kept one eye on the horizon, the other on the boy. The attack came sudden as lightning. A rifle cracked, the bullet whining past Ethan's ear. He shoved Sam from the saddle, both of them hitting the dirt hard. Splinters flew as a fence post exploded beside them. "Down!" Ethan barked, rolling to one knee and firing into the scrub where smoke drifted. A horse screamed. Another shot whistled overhead, then another. The boy's face was pale as chalk, but his eyes were wide, alive. Ethan returned fire, steady, measured. A shout rang out, curses carrying on the wind. He saw one rider wheel away, another clutching his arm. Then silence. The attackers had tested him and pulled back. For now, he dragged Sam to his feet. The boy's hands trembled, but he stood tall. "I didn't run," Sam said, voice shaking. "No," Ethan admitted. "You didn't." They rode back under a sky bruised with clouds, the boy quiet, Ethan's thoughts heavy. The war had come to his doorstep, and there was no sending it away. That evening they prepared. The woman, her name, he learned at last, was Margaret, moved through the yard with fierce determination. She hauled water, stacked firewood. And when Ethan went to mend the barn door, she lifted a beam he could barely shift. He stopped, staring at her strength. She met his look without flinching. "You think I'm weak because I'm a woman," she said flatly. "But I've been holding up this family alone for longer than you've been watching from your porch." He didn't answer, but he felt the truth of it in his chest. The children, too, found their place. Sam carried water, determined to prove himself again. The middle child, Anna, gathered eggs, her small hands careful. The youngest, Ruth, stayed close to her mother. But once Ethan caught her at the cottonwood, staring at the small mound of earth where his wife and boy lay. She turned to him with wide, solemn eyes, and for the first time in years he felt the sting of memory not as a wound, but as a tether pulling him back to life. Night fell heavy, bringing with it the smell of smoke. Ethan's head snapped up, heart pounding. He ran to the window. Flames licked at the edge of the barn roof, fire arrows still burning in the dirt. "They're here," he shouted. Margaret was already moving, shoving the children toward the cellar. "Stay down. Don't come out till I say." Her voice was steel. Ethan grabbed his rifle and bolted for the door. The night exploded with shouts, horses pounding across the yard. A bullet shattered the porch rail. He fired back, dropping a man from his saddle. Margaret was beside him, pitchfork in hand, her face lit by firelight. She drove the tines into another rider who crashed near the well, screaming. The barn crackled as flames raced along the roof. Ethan's heart clenched, his cattle, his feed, his work of 2 decades, all about to vanish in smoke. But there was no time to mourn. A man lunged from the dark, blade flashing. Ethan caught him with the rifle stock, bone crunching beneath the blow. Margaret fought like a force of nature, swinging the pitchfork, her shawl burning at the edge, but her arms never slowing. Together, they drove the raiders back, one falling, another limping off into the night. Then, as sudden as it began, the yard grew quiet but for the crackle of the barn. Ethan dropped to his knees, hauling water, but the fire had already claimed the loft. He and Margaret fought the blaze until their hands blistered, but the barn collapsed with a groan that shook the ground. Sparks leapt into the sky, lighting their weary faces. At last silence fell. The outlaws were gone for now. The yard smelled of smoke and blood. Margaret leaned on the well, sweat streaking her soot-darkened face. Ethan stood beside her, chest heaving. "You fight like a soldier," he said, voice rough. "I fight like a mother," she answered. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Respect, maybe, or the recognition of two souls long hardened by loss. When the children emerged from the cellar, Ruth ran to her mother, clinging tight. Sam looked at Ethan, eyes shining with questions he didn't ask. Anna wept quietly, her small shoulders shaking. Ethan turned away, staring at the blackened ruin of his barn. 21 years he'd kept to himself, built his life around silence, and in one night it had burned. Yet when he looked back at the woman and her children, he realized the silence inside him had cracked too. Later, as they tended wounds by the dim glow of a lantern, Ethan found a scrap of paper nailed to the fence. The writing was jagged, scrawled in haste, "Asterisk will be back. Next time, none of you live, asterisk." He read it once, then folded it slowly, sliding it into his pocket. His eyes met Margaret's across the table. She didn't ask what it said. She already knew. The night stretched long, the children drifting into uneasy sleep, but Ethan and Margaret sat awake, shoulders heavy with exhaustion yet too alert to rest. The coyotes cried out in the distance, their howls rising and falling like a warning. For the first time in years, Ethan spoke more than a few words. "They won't stop. Not till they're dead, or we are." Margaret didn't flinch. "Then we make sure it's not us." The lantern hissed softly, shadows dancing against the log walls. Ethan watched her for a long moment. This giant of a woman who had marched through fire to protect her children, who had stepped into his solitude and shattered it with her strength. Against his will, he felt something stir, something like purpose long forgotten. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "Then we'll need to be ready." Margaret's mouth curved into the faintest of smiles, weary but unbroken. "Ready's all I've ever been." Outside, the night closed in around the lonely ranch, its silence broken now by more than the wind. Men had marked this place, and blood had already been spilled. But within those walls, for the first time in 2 decades, Ethan was not alone. He was part of something again, whether he wanted it or not. And in the darkness beyond the fence, the storm gathered strength, waiting for dawn. The dawn broke harsh and red, as if the very sky had been slit open. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, boots planted in the dust, watching the sun climb while the smoke-stained timbers of his ruined barn smoldered behind him. The air carried the bitter tang of ash, and every breath reminded him of what was lost. Yet his eyes were steady. The scrap of paper burned in his pocket, the words etched deep in his mind. "Next time, none of you live." Margaret came out of the house, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, though the morning was already warm. Her face bore the marks of a sleepless night, but her eyes were sharp, unyielding. She joined him in silence, and together they stared out across the land as though waiting for the horizon itself to move. "They'll come today," Ethan said at last, his voice gravel. She didn't ask how he knew. She only nodded. "Then we finish it." Her words struck him harder than the smoke in his lungs. This woman, who had lost everything but still stood tall, was ready to fight to the end. In her he saw no fear, only the fierce devotion of a mother who would not let her children be taken. It stirred something in him he thought had died 21 years ago, the will to stand for more than himself. He went to the shed, one of the few outbuildings spared by fire. Dust coated the tools, but among them he found what he needed: spades, wire, an old axe, buckets of nails. He dragged them into the yard and set to work. Margaret joined him without being asked. Together they dug shallow trenches near the fence line, laid sharpened stakes, rigged tripwires with tin pans to rattle an alarm. The sweat ran down Ethan's back, the sun climbing higher, but his hands moved steady. Sure. Sam worked beside them, eager, his thin arms straining as he carried wood and hammered nails. The boy's jaw was clenched in determination, a mirror of his mother's strength. Anna fetched water from the well, her small hands raw but tireless. Even Ruth, the youngest, gathered stones in her apron, piling them like ammunition near the porch. Each child, in their way, prepared for war. By midday, the ranch looked less like a homestead and more like a fortress. Ethan straightened, wiping grit from his brow, and glanced at Margaret. She leaned on the haft of the axe, her breath coming heavy, but her eyes still burning with that same fierce light. "You should take the children and go," Ethan said quietly. "Find the next town. It's a hard ride, but safer than staying." Margaret shook her head. "If we run, they'll hunt us down. You know it as well as I do. Best chance we've got is to stand right here." He studied her, wanting to argue, but the truth was plain. He gave a single nod, then turned to the house. Inside, he opened the chest he hadn't touched in years. From it, he drew a revolver, worn but clean, and a box of cartridges still full. He sat at the table and began to load them. One by one, the clicks sharpened the silence. Margaret stepped into the doorway, watching him. "You've done this before." "Once," he answered, not looking up. "And I swore I'd never do it again." "Why?" He paused, the last bullet in his hand. His eyes lifted, and for the first time he spoke of what had long remained buried. "Because I lost them anyway. My wife, my boy. I fought, but it didn't matter. They died just the same. So I stopped fighting. Figured if I kept to myself, no one else could die, because of me." Margaret stepped forward, her shadow falling across the table. "You didn't lose because you fought. You lost because the world takes, no matter what we do. But these children," her voice tightened, "they need someone willing to fight. Not just me. You." The words sank deep. He closed the revolver with a snap and slid it into the holster at his hip. When he rose, something in him had changed. He was no longer the hermit clinging to silence. He was a man with something to defend. The afternoon stretched, the air heavy, waiting. The children stayed close to the house while Ethan and Margaret took positions, eyes on the horizon. It came at last, a dust cloud, faint at first, then growing until the thunder of hooves rolled like distant storm. 10 riders broke over the rise, black against the blazing sky. They came hard and fast, rifles glinting, their shouts carrying on the wind. At their head rode a broad man with a scar slashing down his cheek, his coat flaring like wings. The leader, his gaze fixed on the ranch with the hunger of a wolf. Ethan's hands were steady as he raised his rifle. "Stay low," he muttered to Margaret. She gave no answer, only hefted her axe. The riders closed in. Ethan fired first. One outlaw pitched sideways from his saddle, hitting the ground hard. The others hooped and spurred faster. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the fence, kicking up dust. Ethan worked the lever of his Winchester smooth as breath, shot after shot finding its mark. Sam, crouched by the porch, lifted the old shotgun Ethan had given him. The blast echoed, and a rider toppled with a scream. The outlaws swarmed the yard. Horses crashed into the tripwires, tin pans clattering, animals rearing and throwing their riders. Margaret waded in, her axe cleaving through the chaos, her voice a raw cry. Ethan moved beside her, rifle cracking, revolver roaring when the chamber ran dry. The children darted like shadows, Anna dragging ammunition, Ruth hurling stones with all the fury in her tiny body. The fight was brutal, close. A man lunged at Ethan with a knife, the blade flashing. Ethan caught his wrist, twisted, drove the revolver into his gut, and pulled the trigger. Blood sprayed hot across his hands. Another came at Margaret, but she swung the axe with both arms, knocking him from his horse like a rag doll. The air filled with smoke, screams, the thunder of hooves. And still they came. Then the leader was among them, scarred face twisted in a grin. He leveled his pistol and fired. The shot grazed Ethan's shoulder, spinning him back. Pain flared hot, but he steadied, aiming for the man's chest. Before he could fire, the outlaw wheeled his horse toward the porch. In a flash, he leaned low, arms snaking out, and yanked Ruth from where she crouched behind the rail. The child screamed, kicking as the man hauled her before him, pistol pressed her head. "Drop it," the leader bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Drop the gun or she dies." Ethan froze. His breath caught. The world narrowed to the sight of Ruth's terrified face, the barrel against her temple. His own boy's face flashed in his mind, fever bright, slipping away as he held him helpless. He couldn't lose another child, not again. He lowered the rifle slowly, letting it fall to the dirt. His revolver followed. Around them, The fight stilled. The outlaws circled, panting, bloodied but grinning now that the upper hand was theirs. Margaret stood rigid, axe in hand, her eyes burning holes into the leader. "That's better," the scarred man sneered. "Now, watch close while I take what's owed." But Ethan was not finished. His hand twitched near his boot, where a second revolver lay hidden, strapped inside the leather. He kept his gaze steady, his body loose, waiting for the right breath. The leader raised his pistol, pressing it harder against Ruth's head. "Say goodbye." Ethan moved, his hand blurred, the hidden revolver clearing leather in a flash. The shot cracked, echoing like thunder. The leader's eyes went wide, the grin frozen on his face as the bullet tore through his chest. He toppled from the saddle, Ruth slipping free into Margaret's arms. For a heartbeat, the yard was silent. Then the outlaws broke, panic shattering their ranks. Some fled on horseback, others limped into the scrub, leaving their dead behind. Within moments, the ranch was theirs again. Ethan stood in the dust, chest heaving, the revolver smoking in his hand. Blood trickled from the wound in his shoulder, but he hardly felt it. Margaret clutched Ruth tight, her face fierce with relief. Sam and Anna clung to her, all three children alive, whole. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. Ethan looked around at the bodies, the wreckage, the ruin. His land was scarred, but it still stood. And for the first time in 21 years, he felt something stir in his chest that was not grief, not silence, but life. Margaret stepped to him, Ruth still in her arms. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. "We're not leaving. Not unless you tell us to." Ethan met her eyes. In them, he saw not just the strength of a mother, but the promise of something more, something he had thought forever lost. He let out a long breath, the words slow, heavy with meaning. "Don't go," he said. The children pressed close, uncertain but hopeful. Margaret gave a small nod, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. The sun had climbed high now, burning the sky clear of smoke. Ethan looked out over the land, the fences scarred, the barn reduced to ash, but still his heart beat strong. He had chosen silence for 21 years, but silence could not hold against the storm. And perhaps storms weren't only meant to destroy. Perhaps they were meant to clear the air, to make way for something new. That night, as the family slept in the house that no longer felt empty, Ethan sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the stars. He knew the frontier would never be kind, that danger would always ride the horizon. But he also knew he was no longer alone. And in the hush of the night, with the soft sound of children's breathing behind him, he felt something he had not in decades. He felt ready to live again.